What if everything you've been told about this war is missing the most important part? And what if the ending is already decided, not by opinions, but by patterns that have repeated throughout history for centuries? Today, I want to do something different from what we usually do. Most of the time, I focus on explaining what is happening right now. I try to give you a clear framework, tools that help you understand the world as it unfolds in real time. And recently, we've done that a lot while analyzing this war. But today is not about explaining the present. Today is about making a prediction. And before I do that, we need to go back, because understanding how we got here is not optional, it's essential. If you understand how I made the first three predictions, then you'll understand why what I'm about to say today is not a guess, not speculation, and not just an opinion. It is the logical outcome of everything we've studied together. So let's rewind to May 2024. At that time, Joe Biden was still the president of the United States. Donald Trump was facing 91 criminal charges. The mainstream media was confident, almost certain, that Trump could not win. At the same time, most analysts were saying there would be no war with Iran. On the surface, the world looked stable, predictable, even calm. But in this classroom, I made three very specific predictions. First, that Donald Trump would win the presidential election in November 2024. Second, that the United States would go to war with Iran. And third, that the United States would lose that war and that this loss would permanently reshape the global order. Now, here we are. Two of those predictions have already become reality. Trump won the election. America went to war with Iran. And now, the entire world is watching closely to see whether the third prediction will also come true. But here's the key point you need to understand. I didn't make those predictions because I'm special. I didn't make them because I have some unique ability to see the future. I made them because I used a method, a structured way of thinking. And that method is what I call predictive history using game theory and recurring structural patterns from history to understand where events are heading. Today, I'm going to use that same method to make the most important prediction I've made so far. I'm going to explain how this war ends, but I don't want you to simply accept what I'm saying. I want you to follow the reasoning, step by step. I want you to test it yourself. That's the purpose of this class. So how does this method actually work? I focus on three things. First, structure. These are the deep forces shaping a situation: geography, population, economic systems. These factors don't change quickly, and because of that, they limit what outcomes are even possible. Second, incentives. In game theory, every player is acting in their own interest. So the real question is not what they claim they want, but what they actually want. And those two are often very different. Third, history. Not because history repeats perfectly, it doesn't, but because human behavior and the nature of empires follow patterns that appear again and again. If you understand those patterns, you can recognize them as they unfold in real time. Now let's apply this to the war. Let's start with the players and what they truly want, because that's where clarity begins. America says it wants to stop Iran from developing nuclear weapons. It says it wants to promote democracy in Iran. It says it wants peace and stability in the Middle East. That's the official narrative. But what does America actually want? The real objective is control over the global oil supply. And that matters because oil is the foundation of the petrodollar system, and the petrodollar system is the foundation of American financial power. Since 1973, global oil has been traded in US dollars. This creates constant demand for the dollar worldwide. It allows America to print money and run massive deficits without collapsing its own economy. Without the petrodollar, America cannot sustain its military. Without its military, it cannot maintain its global influence. So strip everything else away, and the goal becomes very simple. Control the Middle East, control the oil, and keep the petrodollar system alive. Now look at Iran. Iran's primary goal is survival. For decades, it has been under American sanctions. Since 1979, the United States has attempted to destabilize or replace its government. Iran has seen what happened to Iraq, to Libya, to Syria. It understands the pattern. It knows that if it does not resist, it risks destruction. So survival is non-negotiable. But Iran's ambitions go beyond that. It wants recognition as a legitimate regional power. It wants sanctions removed permanently. It wants lasting control over the Strait of Hormuz, not just during wartime, but as a long-term economic advantage. And it wants its regional allies, Yemen, Hezbollah, Iraq, to be secured as part of any future outcome. Then there's Israel. Israel's objective is more strategic than it appears on the surface. It is positioning itself to become the dominant power in the Middle East as America's influence declines. In many ways, it is proving itself to the global elite, the financial networks, asset managers, and power structures that shape the world system, that it can take on the role of enforcement, that it has the unity, the discipline, and the strategic clarity to act as the next stabilizing force when America can no longer do so. And finally, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, their goal is also survival, but their position is weaker. They cannot defend themselves independently, and they are caught between stronger powers. Their strategy is simple: align themselves as closely as possible with whoever emerges as the winner, and shift quickly when the balance becomes clear. Now that we understand the players and their true interests, we can move to the next layer, the structural realities. Because in the end, interests alone don't decide outcomes. Structure does. So now that we've clearly identified the players and what they actually want beneath the surface, we need to shift our focus to something even more important: the structure of this conflict. Because no matter how strong intentions are, no matter how aggressive strategies become, outcomes are ultimately shaped and limited by structural realities. These are the forces that don't change quickly, the constraints that define what is possible and what is not. And if you ignore structure, you will always misunderstand how a war ends. So let's walk through the key structural facts of this war carefully, because they form the backbone of everything that follows. The first structural reality is this: America is dominating the air war, but it cannot win the war from the air alone. This is critical. The United States has the most advanced air force in the world: fighter jets, stealth bombers, precision targeting systems, intelligence networks that allow it to strike with incredible accuracy. And in the early phase of this conflict, America has already inflicted significant damage on Iran. It has targeted nuclear facilities, disrupted command structures, and attempted to weaken Iran's missile and drone capabilities. From a purely aerial perspective, America looks powerful, even overwhelming. But here's the limitation, and it's not just theoretical. It's proven by history. Wars are not won from the air alone. There's no modern example of a country being successfully regime changed purely through bombing. It simply does not happen. You can destroy infrastructure, you can create chaos, but if the population remains committed and the leadership stays intact, the country does not surrender. We've seen this repeatedly. The United States bombed North Vietnam for years, yet Vietnam did not give in. During World War II, Germany endured relentless bombing from the British, but it did not surrender until ground forces physically entered its territory. The pattern is consistent: air power can weaken, but it cannot finish. So if America's true objective is regime change in Iran, then at some point it faces a hard reality. It would have to commit ground troops. There is no alternative path to that outcome. And this is where the situation becomes extremely dangerous, because a ground invasion of Iran is not comparable to previous conflicts like Iraq. Iran is significantly larger, roughly 4 times the size of Iraq, with a population of around 90 million people. Its terrain is mountainous, difficult to navigate, and naturally defensive. But even more importantly, Iran has not been preparing for weeks or months. It has been preparing for a ground invasion for 25 years. That means underground military facilities built into mountain ranges, decentralized production of drones and weapon systems, and a military strategy specifically designed to counter helicopters, armored vehicles, and infantry units. This is not a battlefield that can be controlled through overwhelming force alone. It is designed to absorb and resist that force over time. And that leads us to the second structural reality. The cost dynamic of this war is fundamentally unsustainable for America. At a basic level, the economics of this conflict are working against the United States. Iran is using relatively inexpensive tools, drones that can cost around $50,000. In response, America is using interceptor missiles that cost anywhere from $3 million to $10 million to stop a single drone. That means for every one Iranian drone, America is spending between 60 to 200 times more just to neutralize the threat. And Iran is not sending these drones individually. It is launching them in large groups, sometimes hundreds at once. This creates a massive strain on American resources, particularly its interceptor stockpiles. In fact, what we are seeing right now is something unprecedented. the most powerful military in human history, is operating under time pressure, not because of strategy, but because of supply limitations. America is racing to achieve its objectives before it runs out of the weapons needed to defend itself. That alone tells you how serious the imbalance is. And replacing these weapons is not a quick process. The military-industrial system in the United States is slow, expensive, and deeply inefficient. Advanced systems like the F-35 took decades to develop, and interceptor missiles require complex manufacturing that cannot be scaled instantly. Meanwhile, Iran's drone production is decentralized. Its factories are spread across different locations, often hidden in civilian areas, and can be rebuilt quickly, even after being targeted. Over time, this imbalance does not stabilize, it gets worse. The longer the war continues, the more pressure builds on America's resources. Now consider the third structural reality, which is economic pressure, and this extends far beyond the battlefield. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most critical choke points in the global economy, carrying roughly 20% of the world's oil supply. At this moment, Iran has effective control over it. That means this war is not just about military outcomes, it is directly tied to global energy markets. And it doesn't stop there. Yemen has also entered the conflict, threatening the Red Sea, which handles another 12 to 15% of global trade. When you disrupt both of these routes simultaneously, the consequences are immediate and global. Oil prices surge, potentially reaching $150 to $200 per barrel. Fertilizer production becomes strained. Food prices increase worldwide. Supply chains begin to break down. And what follows is not just instability, but the real possibility of a global economic downturn. This kind of pressure does not stay isolated at the international level. It feeds directly back into domestic politics, especially in the United States. Ordinary people begin to feel it in their daily lives. Gas becomes more expensive, groceries cost more, and naturally, the question starts to emerge. Why are we involved in this war? Why are we paying the price for it? And the answer leads back to the conflict itself. That brings us to the fourth structural reality. American political will is not strong enough to sustain a long, costly war. Right now, support for this war sits at around 40%, and that number is not stable. It is likely to decline as casualties increase and economic pressure intensifies. Historically, the United States has struggled to maintain public support for prolonged conflicts without clear victories. We saw this in Vietnam, where public opinion turned sharply as the war dragged on. We saw it again in Iraq and Afghanistan. Each time, the pattern is the same. Initial support gives way to frustration, then to opposition, and eventually to withdrawal. The American public has a limit, a threshold of pain it is willing to handle, and once that threshold is crossed, political support collapses. Iran understands this very well. It has studied American behavior over decades. It knows that it does not need to defeat the United States militarily in a traditional sense. It only needs to extend the conflict long enough, increase the cost high enough, and apply enough pressure to push America beyond that threshold. That is the strategy. So now, step back and look at what we have. We have the players and their true motivations. We have the structural realities that constrain their actions. And when you combine these two, a pattern begins to emerge. The outcome is no longer random. It starts to become predictable. And this is the point where we move from analysis to prediction, because once you see the structure clearly, the direction of the war becomes much harder to ignore. Now that we've built the full picture, the players, their real motivations, and the structural limits shaping their decisions, we can finally move to the core question. How does this war actually end? And I want to approach this carefully, step by step, because the answer is not simple, but it is deeply logical. Once you see the structure clearly, the possible outcomes narrow down dramatically. In reality, this war ends in one of two ways, and everything depends on a single critical decision. Does America send ground troops into Iran, or does it not? That one choice determines everything that follows. So let's break both scenarios down clearly, because each leads to a completely different future. First, Scenario 1. America does not send ground troops. It keeps this war limited to air power. In this version of events, the United States continues its aerial campaign, striking targets across Iran, attempting to weaken its military infrastructure, disrupt its capabilities, and create enough pressure to force concessions. At the same time, Iran continues its strategy, launching drones, firing missiles, maintaining pressure across multiple fronts. The war doesn't end quickly. It stretches out over months, possibly even years. And during this time, something important happens. America's interceptor stockpiles begin to drain. The cost of maintaining the conflict continues to rise. Every engagement becomes more expensive than the last. Meanwhile, the economic effects spread globally. Oil prices remain elevated, supply chains remain unstable, and the pressure on the global economy intensifies. But perhaps most importantly, the political pressure inside the United States continues to build. The longer the war lasts without a clear victory, the more difficult it becomes to justify. Public support declines, criticism increases, and eventually, and this is the key word eventually, the United States begins to look for a way out. Not an obvious retreat, but a controlled exit, something that can be presented as success rather than failure. At that point, you can imagine the message. A speech to the nation, a statement that objectives have been achieved, that Iran's capabilities have been significantly reduced, that it is time to bring American forces home. And on the surface, it appears like a victory. But beneath that narrative, the reality is very different. America begins to withdraw from the Middle East. And as that withdrawal becomes clear, the entire region starts to shift. The Gulf states, which have been balancing carefully between powers, begin to adjust quickly. Some move closer to Iran, seeking stability and security. Others move toward Israel, aligning with what they see as the next dominant force. The petrodollar system begins to weaken as control over oil becomes less centralized under American influence. And Iran, still standing, still controlling the Strait of Hormuz, emerges with something it has been seeking for decades: recognition as a legitimate regional power. In this scenario, America loses the war, but it is not a catastrophic loss. It is a managed retreat. The United States remains intact. Its global position is weakened. Its credibility is damaged, but it does not collapse. It steps back rather than falling apart. Now let's look at scenario 2, and this is where things become far more dangerous. In this version, America decides that air power is not enough. Pressure builds from multiple directions. The Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, face increasing attacks and demand decisive action. Israel pushes for a stronger response. And within the American leadership, frustration grows as the war drags on without clear results. At some point, that pressure leads to a decision to escalate. Ground troops are deployed, Marines are sent in. And this is where the situation shifts from difficult to potentially catastrophic. Because this is exactly the scenario Iran has been preparing for over decades. A ground invasion is not a surprise to Iran. It is the scenario it expects, the scenario it has built its entire defensive strategy around. Those underground bases hidden within mountains, those decentralized weapon systems, those specialized defenses designed for close combat, all of them come into play at once. But the danger is not limited to what happens inside Iran. The moment American troops are physically inside Iranian territory, the entire region becomes unstable in a new way. The conflict expands outward. Iraq could move its forces into neighboring territories. Yemen could escalate its operations into Saudi Arabia from the south. American bases across the Gulf, critical for supply lines and reinforcements, become vulnerable from multiple directions simultaneously. Suddenly, the United States is not just fighting one war inside Iran. It is facing a collapsing regional position, with threats emerging on multiple fronts at the same time. And to sustain a serious ground war in Iran, the scale of commitment required is enormous. Hundreds of thousands of troops, possibly more. The current active U.S. military is around 1.3 million personnel, and even that may not be sufficient without additional support. This raises a question that cannot be avoided. Would the United States need to introduce a draft? Would young Americans, as young as 18, be required to join the military and fight in this war? And if that happens, what does that do to the country internally? The answer is not difficult to imagine. Massive public resistance, social unrest, deep political divisions, a level of internal instability that begins to resemble something far more serious than protests, something closer to a societal fracture. Politically, it would be devastating. It could end Trump's career. Economically, the strain would accelerate financial instability. And militarily, the war itself would become increasingly difficult to control. This is what can be called the ground invasion trap. And once entered, it becomes extremely difficult to escape. In this scenario, the outcome is not just a loss, it is a catastrophic loss, one that has the potential to reshape not just the region, but the global balance of power in a far more dramatic and immediate way. So when you compare these two paths, the contrast becomes clear. One leads to a prolonged air war, followed by a controlled withdrawal. The other leads to escalation, entanglement, and potentially irreversible consequences. And now that we've walked through both scenarios in detail, we are finally in a position to move to the next step, the actual predictions. Because once you understand the structure and the possible paths, predicting the most likely outcome is no longer speculation. It becomes a matter of following the logic to its conclusion.